my next guest is, among many other things, the co-author of this book that has been getting a lot of discussion around here lately. And I am very much honored to have him join us. And then in particular, in addition to that, uh, to have been able to run into him at the Summer Institute for the American Association of University Professors. And we're going to build a little bit about that as well this morning and early afternoon. And I'm talking about Andrew J. Douglas, who, among many other things, is a professor of political science and a faculty affiliate in Africana Studies and International Comparative Labor Studies at Morehouse College. He is the author of In the Spirit of Critique, Thinking Politically in the Dialectical Tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois and the Critique of the Competitive Society. He lives in Atlanta, Georgia, and is joining us now, perhaps from there. But welcome. Good morning. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. And like I said, it was... So when I got the invitation to go to the AAUP Summer Institute, I don't know that world much at all. So when I saw that you were going to be involved and in a session that I wanted to be in anyway, it was perfect. It was great to meet you down there. And I definitely want to get to that part of the conversation because you've also introduced me to some new literature. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. So there's a lot to get to, but I do want to start with this book, The Prophet of Discontent, because I can't praise it enough. I really appreciate what you and Jared Loggins have done, and he may join us later on if he gets out of class in time, and if not, we'll catch him another time. But I wanted you to tell us anything that you would want to about the book. I know you've had a chance to see a little bit of what we've had to say here about it. And if there's anything you think we've gotten wrong or didn't focus on properly, I would love to hear that as well. Yeah, let's start there. And again, welcome.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And I should just mention to the audience, my co-author, Jared Loggins, he's teaching today, as you mentioned. He hopefully can join us, but I don't know if he's going to be able to make that happen. You have done this book, tremendous service, and I really appreciate it. In listening to you talk about this and your guests talk about this, it really feels like you get exactly what we're trying to convey. And so I was hesitant even to come on the program. I mean, I feel like the book is already at a level, and I don't know that I can elevate it any further than you already have. So I think, you've really done a great job reading closely and capturing the spirit of exactly what we were trying to convey in the book. So, I'm happy to address try to flesh out any questions that you have, but I think you've done a brilliant job of discussing this book. So
well, cool. I appreciate that. I mean, where I felt and feel the most out of my depth is when you and Jared get into discussions of the philosophy.
Yeah.
And so I did want to invite, in addition, if you had any critiques of how we were discussing your book, if there was. And admittedly, I'll apologize to you here. I should have had a more specific question prepared for this, and I'm just now thinking I didn't do that. But when it comes to the philosophical elements that you all get to, I mean, that's again way above my pay grade, so to speak. So if there was something you would want to say more about that, please. And then. I already see there's folks in the chat that say they have some questions, so maybe we can work some of those in as well. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think the some of the questions that you maybe had revolve around our engagement with Marx and sort of some of the stuff on sort of the logic of how racial capitalism works and our effort to kind of read Marx's critique of commodity fetishism into King's assessment of how value and devaluation sort of work in racial capitalist society. And I should back up and say, this, as you've indicated, it's a thin book. It's a short book. It was an occasional piece that we had an opportunity to do for a particular series. And Jared and I are both political theorists. We're not historians, we're not biographers, we're not theologians. We're political theorists who come out of a broadly critical theory tradition. And so what we thought we could do was write a book that tried to reconstruct the critical theory of capitalism that King's work presupposes. So it's really a work in kind of reconstructive social theory, reconstructive critical theory, which means that we have to kind of fill in the gaps here and there and try to sort of flesh out in ways that King himself did not always do, some of the presuppositions and the logical assumptions that he's making about capitalist society and racism. And so one of the ways that we thought to do that was to really center this question of, how is King's call for a radical revolution of values, right? He always talks about this need for a radical revolution of values. How is this complicated by the way value is produced and circulated in capitalist society, right? I think there's a tendency to read King kind of superficially on this and think that values just has to do with like getting our consciousness right, kind of getting our morality and ethics right. And then so long as we're thinking about things the right sort of way and our heart's in the right place, that somehow everything will just fall into place. But we confront, a material reality that doesn't allow us to treat one another as human beings. It doesn't allow us to value Black life. That doesn't allow us to value Black community building. Even if we want to do that, right? And so, how is value produced and circulated in capitalist society in ways that materially reproduce, cycles of Black devaluation, expropriation of Black life, labor, communities, land, and so we tried to kind of build some of that out, in the book. And one of the ways that we did that is using, on the one hand, I think sort of the two major kind of figures, scholarly figures that we worked alongside were Cedric Robinson on the one hand, both this notion of racial capitalism and I think more significantly his analysis of the Black radical tradition, his understanding of that. But then the other was Marx, and there's a lot in Marx, obviously, and we just kind of picked up on a few strands of Marx's thought. One is this idea of capital as value in motion, that capital is a social relation of production. It's not a thing. It's not a stock of machines or fund. It's it's a social relation of production that moves through cycles of accumulation, reinvestment, and that maps on quite nicely to King's thinking about value and this inescapable network of mutuality and how we're all tied together. And the other aspect of Marx that we really picked up on was this stuff on commodity fetishism, where Marx talks about how under capitalism, a definite relation between human beings takes on the form of a relation between things. And what he's getting at there is, we're compelled to commodify everything, to commodify ourselves, to commodify others. We navigate this world of commodities, these things that have value based on what the market will bear, right? And what we noticed was that this maps on quite nicely to King's analysis of how we have moved from a person-oriented society to a thing-oriented society. I mean, the language doesn't acknowledge any sort of debt to Marx on that, but the language that he uses there about sort of thing-oriented society, person-oriented society, is very consistent with Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism in the first volume of Capital. And so, I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of
no, that's cool. I appreciate it. Like I said, I left.
Any interjections?
Yeah. Well, I do in the sense that I do have an important one to make here in a couple of senses. So one, I just left you hanging with a very vague, indirect question. So that's my fault. But the other one is that, so I'm going to get out of the chat in a second because the chat can get distracting, but they are making some as usual poignant and funny points. One about us being twins, and that we did happen to both be wearing blue tops. So that's, I think, adding to this twinness, and the jokes are just running rampant. So that's one thing. I think that's funny. That's hilarious. The other that is that your co-author Jared Loggins is here.
Okay.
So what I'll introduce him first by saying he doesn't know this, but he has been recruited into my army of the resuscitation of the name Jared. It has taken a beating over the last few decades. So whether he's aware of this or not, he has been recruited. And I'm talking about Jared A. Loggins, who, among many other things, is a visiting assistant professor of Black Studies and Political Science at Amherst College, and joining us now, fresh, I think, out of class. And thank you for joining us. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. On my way to class, I'm
Oh.
teaching around 11:30-ish, so I'm gonna have to get off early. But
Okay.
I had to come. I had to
No.
show my face.
No, I appreciate it. And so first of all, let me say quickly, since I know you only have a few minutes, then one, you're always welcome back. We can always extend and get the conversation going more. Two, really definitely wanted to thank you for this work and appreciate your contribution to this particular book and to the broader, I think, important struggle around King, radical politics, all of that. So thank you. And so that said, I had offered, I'll say the same thing that I offered Andrew. Was there anything that you may have heard in our discussion here of the book that you wanted to critique or add on to or amend, or is there anything about yeah, well, I'll start there, or anything else that you wanted to point out in the few minutes that you do have?
Yeah, I mean, everything that sort of Andrew suggests about our engagement with Marx is right. The other thing I would add about King is that, he is, of course, he claims to have read Marx at Boston University. But one of the arguments that I think we're trying to stress in the book is that King also owes much of his analysis to indigenous Black struggle, just struggle on the ground, the ways that kind of ordinary, everyday, working class Black people are theorizing and understanding their condition. And that matters a lot for how we think about how a figure like King is sort of complicating, kind of radical intellectual traditions such as Marxism. That he is appropriating that tradition, much like a figure like Du Bois in some ways, by thinking about kind of the ways that struggle on the ground kind of allows him a particular vantage point of thinking about how capitalism works, how it circulates, how it's reproduced. And also, I think there's a way in which kind of pinpointing the kind of indigenous Black struggle allows us to kind of think about kind of the pressure points for struggling against capitalism, right? So what would it look like for kind of populations that have been rendered surplus and disposable to organize and struggle against capitalism? Like, what do those struggles look like, right? So there are different ways of thinking about how to struggle. And one thing that we were trying to do in the book is to think about how King is sort of in this tension between with the kind of Black working classes, particularly in the urban North, as he kind of transitions around 1966, 1967 to thinking about urban poverty in the North. That he's sort of in a tension with struggles on the ground.
So just quickly, and again, we'll have to have many more of these conversations. But so when my buddy Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows was here, we had a little disagreement over, if I remember it correctly, the extent to which King was consciously engaging Marxism or not. And my whole thing is that he clearly was, that he was grappling with its apparent lack of religion and spirituality, and that he was also struggling with to what extent he could put that on the table and voice that and still build the movement that he wanted to build. And Dr. Burrows, I had a slight disagreement, or had a certain disagreement with that, and then So so what would you both want to say about that? And then is your book addressing that in terms of bringing in this conversation that I know is the tension between Marx and Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism?
Yeah, I mean the kind of thing that looms large in these conversations about the extent to which King engaged with Marx is kind of anti-communism, and the way that King is trying to, kind of negotiate the his kind of the standing of the movement, and he's sort of thinking about kind of he has the state at his back, the FBI is at his back. He's facing up against state repression, and he has to make these kinds of choices and calculations about how he sort of moves. So maybe there's a kind of interpretive argument about kind of the way that anti-communism shapes how he engages with Marxism and the Marxist tradition. Andrew, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that he was particularly engaged with Marxism. I mean, he was exposed to it, no question. I mean, he was confronted with, sort of a Red Scare, sort of, anti-communist sort of political reality that clearly affected, how he presented his arguments. But he was clearly exposed to Marx. There's a great new piece out by Matthew Nichter looking at sort of the old left of the 1930s and its influence on the SCLC. And there's some discussion in there of, his Morehouse professors and the extent to which they were engaged with, very serious thinking about the nature of labor struggles, anti-capitalist struggles, and Marx. So there's a great deal of anecdotal evidence that he was part of a milieu that was really engaged with a certain kind of Marxist analysis. And my earlier comments, I may have misspoke a little bit or misled a little bit. What we were trying to do in the book is just point out a couple of affinities between how King talks about certain aspects of capitalist society and how Marx theorizes sort of the logic of capital. But the book clearly, in the vein of Cedric Robinson, in the vein of racial capitalism, moves beyond a straightforward Marxist analysis in a lot of ways, right? And another sort of literature that we lean on pretty heavily in the book, Michael Dawson, professor at the University of Chicago, has written a lot on racial capitalism. Nancy Fraser, critical theorist, this idea of that kind of conventional Marxist economic front story that focuses on labor exploitation is really the driving feature of capitalism, versus a sort of a fuller, including a racial capitalist account of capitalist society that looks toward a social and political backstory. So behind that front story of economic exploitation, that narrative that Marx tells, there's a whole story about expropriation, racism, patriarchy, state violence, colonialism, and all of that that sort of conditions the possibility for that economic front story, that conditions the possibility for capital accumulation. And, as we try to argue in the book, that sort of fuller account of racial capitalism that goes well beyond Marx is a better kind of theoretical apparatus to read into King's analysis.
It occurred to me, I was thinking about the book just this morning, and it occurred to me that one of the things that I think we're also kind of wrestling with, trying to think with, is in this sort of neoliberal moment, there has been this tendency to try and emancipate capitalism from racism, as if there is a kind of sort of deracialized capitalism that once it's sort of righted in a particular kind of way, that all will be right in the world. And we sort of want to resist that kind of interpretation. There are a number of people kind of in the public light, politicians and all this stuff, who are like, oh yeah, well, once you figure out how to deal with the kind of discrimination in capitalism, or once you figure out how to deal with the kind of the kind of racial blind spots in capitalism, then suddenly, all would be right. And we were like, well, no, that's not the case. It's like we quote Malcolm X in the book. Malcolm X says, you can't have capitalism without racism. They're fundamentally intertwined.
Right. Yeah. It's inappropriate for the moment because there's no time and the book isn't out. Well, to my knowledge, isn't out yet. I certainly haven't read it, but I am thinking of the argument that was introduced to me, at least a couple years ago, by Charisse Burden-Stelly that
Mhm.
Robinson's shortcoming with racial capitalism is a flawed analysis of how Black people engaged Marxism. And so I know she has a new book coming out. I haven't, gotten, but so I'm just wondering. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I'm wondering. It just came to my mind. It just popped into my head as you all were talking, and I just kind of got stuck there. So,
we're all looking forward to that book. What Black
Yeah.
Red Scare?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll have to, but yeah. And then there was this whole tweet. I remember she said, I tweeted just working through her question, and I got dragged into this. This like social media is nonsense. But because I was just thinking publicly, and I even said in the tweet, I don't even know if you can get away with raising this question that she was, in my mind, posing, or that she had posed, or at least, anyway, whatever. So there's the verbal crutch. So, Jared, I know your time is short. So is there anything you would want to say again that you would want to bring up or raise or get us to think about? And again, like I said, I hope this is the first of an ongoing series of discussions. So I would be interested. One question that did come to my mind for the both of you, but I'll ask you now since I know you have class. Is there, what are you working on now? What's next? Is there anything that, or is it out already and I just don't know?
No, it's not out. So as I was writing this book with Andrew years ago, I was in grad school, and I happened to also be working on a dissertation on Darkwater, which is this book that Du Bois wrote in 1920. And that book, my engagement with that book is to sort of think about it in the context of kind of anti-colonial struggle. So Du Bois is sort of anticipating kind of many of the kind of debates and struggles that are kind of going to emerge in the 1930s and 40s. And I'm kind of reading Darkwater as part of that, and trying to read into that book a critique of capitalism that kind of centers or centralizes kind of his aesthetics. He's a sort of radical figure who's sort of thinking with like poetry. He's thinking with different ways of trying to kind of organize propaganda against the system of capitalism. And so that book is trying to think about all of these sort of intellectual currents. But that's what I'm working on right now. It's far from done.
Well, I mean, I don't know why it's far from done. It's easy. It sounds like light work. It sounds like you should be just churning that out. Like, what's the holdup?
Yeah.
But anyway, so look, I appreciate you stopping through, and whenever you all can make it back, we'll have to run it back.
I would be delighted to come back.
No, anytime. And yeah, so thank you very much. Right on. Good luck. Have a good class.
Thank you all.
All right. Peace. Oh, so that was nice. That was a good look. I appreciate him popping through. So unless there was something you wanted to, if there was more on any of that you wanted to get to.
No, I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down in these kind of Marxist, questions.
Well, I
will say,
I never mind that. But yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if we should announce it yet, but he and I and a couple other folks are working on another project as well, a collection of Du Bois's writings on political economy. That's in the very early stages, but we're hoping to pull together, a new edited volume of Du Bois's works focused explicitly on his political economy writings.
Ooh. Ooh. Please. Ooh. Is there if I know it's early, is there any chance there's a section focused on his discussion of cooperatives? Because around here that has become.
It'll absolutely be part of it for sure. Yeah.
Right on. All right. Yeah. Oh, okay. So you heard it here, maybe first, early on. Stay tuned, everybody. Definitely look forward to hearing more about that. Thanks for that.
Yep.
So one of the other topic areas that I did want to raise with you is that is the broad category of higher education, historically Black college and university, and one of the things that similarly united our experiences is that I'm at Morgan, you're at Morehouse, and the first thing I wanted to ask you about is sort of. So I have this I keep referring to it as my longitudinal research project titled Not a Different World, HBCU's Not a Different World. And I'm inviting people, I'll invite you and others to I'll make sure the link is already if it's not already in the show description. It's a short, I think there's 7 questions I'm asking people to respond to and to talk about their experience and share their story in the context of the point being for me that the show A Different World is emblematic of a a propaganda approach to presenting the HBCU to the public. That is, particularly for Black audiences, that it's a space for Blackness, even radical Blackness, but just safe, autonomous. It's a different world, as the show is titled, and that my experience, at least as a faculty member, having never been as a student, is that it's not enough of a different world from the norm in terms of the politics, distribution of resources, et cetera, and so much more. So with that little summary, I am curious to if in terms of what you see as the public presentation of the HBCU experience versus the reality of it, if there's anything you would want to share about that, and even in particular, this concern I have that often enough, part of that public presentation of the HBCU is always around. For Morgan, it's the choir, or the marching band, or the frats and sororities, the homecoming, the step shows, and very little about the academic work, the intellectual life, so just with that vague setup for you, what would you maybe want to say to people about the HBCU experience that they may not know or understand?
I don't know. I mean, let me try to get at this by sort of referencing back to the book, because we do begin to broach some of these kinds of questions in that 5th and concluding chapter, where we look at the Institute of the Black World. So that this is a chapter thinking about when King is killed in '68, and that sort of critique of racial capitalism is really sharpening in that last year of his life, kind of what happens to that legacy after his death. And, another kind of through line of our book is that King's evolving critique was a product of, what we call Black study, following, Fred Moten. Josh Myers has written a great new book called Of Black Study, sort of thinking about this concept. Really sort of sharpening, evolving one's consciousness in community, in movement with others. So we're sort of looking at how King is a kind of a student of Black movements and Black life as a participant, right? And sort of thinking about what that legacy looks like after his death. And we look at the Institute of the Black World, which was originally connected to the King Center, what was then known as the King Memorial Center. Vincent Harding, who was a professor at Spelman at the time, was tapped by Coretta to head up the library, the scholarly sort of apparatus of what was the King Memorial Center, now the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. And he quickly realized, Harding did, that what he wanted to do and the kind of scholarship and study and questions that he wanted to raise, very much in the legacy of King, the radical King, just weren't going to work in a space that was so mainstream oriented, so dependent upon white philanthropy, so dependent upon corporate philanthropy. And so he broke off with another couple of scholar activists, Stephen Henderson, who's a professor at Morehouse at the time, William Strickland, and some others, to start the Institute of the Black World in the 70s as an independent think tank. And so we used that, and we also have some conversation of, another set of conversations that folks were having in this time period, Vincent Harding principally among them, around this idea of the Black University. This idea that Du Bois in a lot of ways pioneered in the 1930s, a couple of really important speeches Du Bois gave in the 30s, trying to think about what an educational institution that was not reducible to, that was not comparable to kind of white world institutions, what we today call predominantly white institutions, that was fully committed to a Black world-making agenda, a Black liberation agenda, to its core, right? Not just as a Black Studies department or something like this, but, the entire institution was built around the presumption that the white capitalist imperialist world, dying civilization, unsustainable, shot through with violence and exploitation, expropriation. How do we, completely move away from that and try to build up, an alternative world, what Du Bois called the Black world? This concept of the Black University really resurfaced in 67, 68, major conference at Howard University called Toward the Black University that took place, in this time. And so to come back to your question about HBCUs today, I think in a lot of ways, I don't think HBCUs are really different from PWIs. They're still, managed by accrediting agencies, the same accrediting agencies that, PWIs are answerable to. They're still dependent upon state funding. They're still dependent upon, white philanthropy. And so what I think happens in these spaces is really no different than what happens at PWIs, in that there is what, Moten and Harney call that undercommons, that space where kind of committed scholarship happens, where folks are reading Fanon in the hallways of their dorms, may not be assigned in a class, but, they're still having these conversations in the hallways about kind of the real substance of it, what they should be, getting credit for, right? And I think that maybe that undercommons is a little bit more robust, at least my experience at Morehouse. I think there still is a contingent of faculty and students who are, really committed to this kind of work. Is that's the dominant narrative? Is that what's promoted by the marketing apparatus? No. But, it's there kind of simmering beneath the surface and thriving in a lot of ways. And so, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but, I think that's where we are, and so what we try to do in that book is really think about what it would take to kind of institutionalize that undercommons. Is it even possible to do that in the process of building institutions that are more fully committed to political education, more fully committed to Black studies, in that process of trying to institutionalize that within a kind of neo-colonial, racial capitalist environment? Are you necessarily going to short circuit what you're trying to do? Is this work just sort of necessarily relegated to the undercommons within the racial capitalist order? And that's a question we don't answer, and I'm not sure I have an answer.
So to get you to assist with what I have to talk about later on tonight, let me ask you the question I know I'm going to be asked later. We met in person for the first time in the context of the American Association of University Professors. Why is it important? Why would it have been important for you to have been there, particularly as an HBCU faculty member, but as a faculty member in general?
Yeah.
And especially again, I kind of want to put it in this context of what many are encouraged to believe about the HBCU experience might suggest that you or I would have no cause,
Yeah.
or in fact would be silly to think about unionizing and collective bargaining and would have any issues in the first place.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I'll just sort of point folks to a couple of things I've read. I got a piece I published on our Morehouse faculty blog, sort of a very cursory history of sort of union organizing efforts at the AUC, at Morehouse and AUC. I think AAUP is actually going to repost that on their blog today. But looking at some of this history, I mean, there is some precedent for this. In the 40s, Walter Chivers, who was one of Martin Luther King's professors, was president of a local of the United Public Workers of America, which was one of the militant sort of red unions in the late 40s that was purged by the CIO in the early 50s. It was the most racially integrated union in the CIO at the time. And there's some really interesting kind of history that needs to be sort of dug up around that. And I'm sure that's true of other HBCUs as well. In terms of AAUP, I'm reminded of another sort of piece that appeared, I think, in Black Agenda Report, Dylan Rodriguez, just last week. He wasn't talking about HBCUs, but just a really nice review. I think it mentions you, Dr. Ball, just sort of talking about, the university space and its limitations and its imperial functions and its policing functions and its disciplinary regimes and all of this sort of stuff. But nevertheless, he says at one point, you're in that space, organize it, right? But realize that it's not the be all and end all. I mean, it's not even necessarily kind of the richest, most capacious sort of part of your organizing work, but wherever you're at, organize that space. And I think that's true for me. So I'm just kind of maybe in the same boat as you. I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on this as well, because when we met over the summer, I got the sense that you were a little bit, ambivalent. I don't know about all this AAP stuff, and I think I'm in a similar boat. But
I mean, for me, to be perfectly honest, it was just a new experience and a new organizational space for me. All of the, as much as and it's a contradiction, as much as I advocate and support generally the idea of socialism and unions and labor, I haven't been much involved directly with the labor movement at all, much less the faculty wing of it. And admittedly, it's been more out of a desperation in my experience with Morgan State that I wanted to get involved, and also it also speaks personally to an insufficient involvement with the sort of radical political grassroots organizational spaces that I would prefer to be in. So all that said, when I show up and even in the space we were in, there was this praise for the Democratic Party and this idea that just things that are just that I just have this visceral. So I just know politically they're not as left as. So that's the first thing, and I always have to remind myself in more of those. But at the same time, hearing the stories that others were sharing, academia it's a mess. I mean, it's just so much wrong and so many people, struggling in so many different ways in what is supposed to be relative to the rest of the labor force, some ideal. So again, I don't know. I'm not being very clear, but that was where I was struggling. So it felt good to meet others who were trying to figure these things out. It felt good to be told immediately now that I'm a member of the American Federation of Teachers and we have millions, whatever, we have this huge, but at the same time, I can't legally organize in Maryland. I can't. And then at the very microcosmic level, even just this week, the efforts to both build and discover what's really going on it's demoralizing. So, and then on top of that, you suggest to me this book. I mean, you did not help. And I know you're not the author, so at some point I do need to finish the book and reach out to the author. But this book here, The Autocratic Academy, Re-envisioning Rule Within America's Universities, which in part is a direct critique specifically of the AAUP and its approach into what it thinks it understands about corporations, about what the university is, what you said to me about charters. I mean, there's, so again, 20 years in at this institution, a few years more all told professionally, and I don't know so much about the terrain I'm walking on. That, you know, shout out to Loaded Lux. I'm just out here, I'm still discovering the inner workings, and it's disturbing. And there's just so much shadiness and people and grift under the banner, in particular, and I'll stop here, in terms of HBCUs, of Blackness, and which is really particularly frustrating for me. That the struggle around the Black community is being abused in this way for, it seems to me, particularly class interests. And so I don't think I've helped you here, but that's all that I'm struggling with in terms of what I think and what I thought.
Yeah,
So.
no, I'm right there with you. I mean, you know, I don't. I'm so disillusioned with higher ed. If I was ever going to move to a different, I would. I don't think I could ever teach anywhere but an HBCU. But HBCUs, to your point, are not, and to what I was trying to get at earlier, are not really any different. But there is this kind of kernel of a possibility at HBCUs that I don't think you get at PWIs, that it is at least potentially possible to build from within something like that Black university ideal. I mean, we're millions of miles away from it, and it would just, I don't even know what that would look like, but it's a possibility in these spaces in ways that it's not at a PWI. And so, for the time being anyway, that's a struggle I'm willing to commit to.
No,
but
for
I will
sure.
Say, go ahead.
Sure. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, this book, I don't quite know what conclusions to draw from this book, but I will say a couple of things about it and encourage folks to read it if you're really sort of interested in, it's much more than just a book about university governance. It really kind of gets to some of these political, economic, crises that the higher ed space is really vivifying for us right now. But his argument is that because of a series of legal precedents throughout the history of the United States, we've come to a position where colleges and universities are legally structured to give basically unilateral governing authority to absentee boards of trustees, right? So they may pay lip service to some shared governance. They may say the faculty or students can contribute to shared governance, but at the end of the day, they sort of legally give unilateral governing authority to these absentee boards that are either, publicly elected by, politicians for political reasons, or at private schools, basically just wealthy, potential donors that come from finance and so forth, right? And so I think, the idea here is that we need to kind of give up on this promise of some kind of gentleman's agreement towards shared governance, which is kind of what the AAUP, has historically been about, and either change the legal structure of these institutions to set them up as cooperatives, right? Governed and run cooperatively as a cooperative corporation would be. Or I think the other takeaway from this book is organize the faculty, right? Collectively bargain, try to win an NLRB election so that you can force the administration to have to collectively bargain with you, right? But in the absence of those two things, there's really not much that faculty can do to kind of save these institutions from, the direction that absentee trustees have moved us in. And what we're seeing in West Virginia right now, to cite, that example, is just, I think, exemplary of what we're going to see all over the place over the next decade or so.
Not to be all in your business, but are you so I'll frame it this way. So we were in a faculty meeting the other day, and it was announced by our rep at the University Council, which is supposed to have been the replacement of our faculty senate that had been given up years before I got there. But it's really just a reporting body. So our rep came back to the College of Liberal Arts and announced in quite a funny way, asking us if we were aware that as a schedule we were on 2 2s and 2 3s, and there was this quiet shockwave that went through the room. And then he asked, "Are any of you on 2 2s or 2 3s?" Of course, nobody raised their hand because we're all on 4 4s, which, for those, just anybody who's not aware, is 4 classes every semester, which, particularly for those who have, really for anybody, but for those who have reached full professor with tenure and all this is unheard of. But the point was that there was this claim by the administration that this change had occurred, but really what they were referencing was that for a select few new hires, they were getting the bumps in salary and then these preferred schedules of reduced course loads. So I'm just wondering to what extent, because in general, it's understood that HBCUs were all on 4 4s, but I honestly I haven't done a full assessment of every HBCU. Does this sound at all familiar in any way?
Yeah, I don't know. This idea of bringing in new folks on with a better deal, that sounds foreign to me. I don't know.
That doesn't happen at Morehouse?
I don't think so. I mean, we have.
Are you serious? I'm trying to
we
read for sarcasm
a lot of
here.
Administrators with faculty status, and that's a problem. It's kind of backdoor way of bolstering your faculty ranks, right? You say you've hired all of these faculty members, but half of them are, deans and associate vice provosts and all this sort of stuff. So that's an issue here. I mean, that's an issue everywhere. But yeah, no, we haven't had this issue of bringing in new folks on sort of better, so certainly with better salaries. I mean, what we call salary compression is an issue.
Right, that's what we get, right.
New hires are brought in at market rate or closer to it than folks who've been around 20, 30 years and have never had a raise or a cost of living adjustment, But different teaching loads, I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, that was new to us too. I was shocked. I don't know to what extent. And the point was, nobody in the room I was in was benefiting from that, or at least they didn't want to. My joke was I didn't think they would. Some might not want to admit it for fear of being jumped or something. Right. Like, how did you get a 2-2? Okay. All right. So we've exhausted the sort of the categories I wanted to go through. So if there's something that you want to bring up, please do. Otherwise, there is this. Let's see, Ricky I saw this one question. In these struggles and appeals, is there any coalition building with staff that are not faculty? That's a good question.
Certainly, well, to some extent. I mean, there's an organization called Higher Ed Labor United, for example, that's really been promoting this wall-to-wall organizing campaigns, wall-to-wall organizing in higher ed. I think the Rutgers strike last spring, they brought together a coalition of folks. But I think that was all teaching faculty of various ranks. So postdocs, adjuncts, part-time, full-time, tenure line. They may have different unions, but sort of bringing them together. This question of what kind of a genuine wall-to-wall organizing effort would look like in higher ed, where you bring faculty members of all ranks together with staff, frontline staff of various ranks. But that seems to be the direction that the labor movement, certainly within higher ed, is moving in, right? Led very much by grad workers, postdocs, sort of a younger sort of sense of solidarity and coalition building that the older folks, the tenure line folks, just don't have for a complicated set of reasons. And this question of I don't want to say too much about what's sort of the internal stuff at Morehouse, but it's been a real challenge for us to bring our part-time faculty together with our full-time faculty. It's been a challenge for us to figure out how staff, not administrators, but staff, what does their representation look like? They had at one time a staff council, but that seems to have dissolved in recent decades. And I don't know what it would take to kind of bring that back together to give them some kind of advocacy apparatus. So I don't know. It's a great question. I think it's one that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about and sort of working toward what I take to be the best answer, which is we got to bring frontline employees of various sorts together.
I don't know what efforts have occurred at Morgan. I have not experienced any, and I haven't seen any. First of all, I haven't experienced much of an effort to organize just the faculty, much less the different ranks in faculty, much less faculty and then staff. The only anecdote I can share is that for a few years in my previous building in which I worked, one of the members of the cleaning crew used to come through and hang out with me and a buddy who was non-faculty staff. And in the discussion, she would often say that I was one of the few faculty that even spoke, much less had any conversations or hung out with. So I don't know what that, to the extent that that's true, there may be still these cavernous gaps between faculty, staff, et cetera, and so forth. But or I just may not be aware of everything that's happening at Morgan. But
yeah, I mean, I think it used to be the case, at least listening to sort of folks talk about Morehouse and the AUC and how it's historically has been more this kind of family environment where people look out for one another across sort of ranks and divisions within the institution. But as kind of the corporatization of higher ed in general just sort of rolls through this campus, that means that we do more contracting, right? So more of the staff, the cleaning staff, the catering, food service staff, they're not employees of the college. They're employed by some vendor or whatever,
That's
right?
right.
And more and more and more of that. And it's even sort of, encroaching into the educational program where you have, sort of vendors and folks who are staffed by vendors doing what are conventionally thought to be, core functions of the college. Recruiting, admissions, talking to prospective students, call centers that respond to financial aid inquiries, and I think that, it hollows out that sense of community and sort of familyhood, and for lack of a, I don't know if those are even, appropriate metaphors, but, that kind of talk that had historically been one of the sort of selling points of an HBCU experience, that it's not just this cold kind of corporate experience, that it's more of a community that will nurture you and stuff. I just think the forces of capitalism as they kind of roll through these spaces are really destroying that aspect of the HBCU experience.
That's a really good point. I forgot about that, and you're right. Our whole food service, whatchamacallit, is contracted out, and if I'm not mistaken, we were just given a presentation for a group doing student services, and if you didn't pay attention carefully, it would sound like this was like a wing of the university, as opposed to proper, at least, as opposed to a contracted out nonprofit or some sort of probably for-profit. I don't, but yeah. It was slick the way it was presented, and you had to. And I remember, but I had forgotten about that. And you're right. That's a really good point. I even asked my students, somewhat related to this, yesterday, did they even realize that you can't get a Coca-Cola product on our campus? And it had not occurred to them that we are a Pepsi contracted campus, right, in terms of even contracting out the vending. The security services are contracted out. The food service, all of that, and I don't think our housing is, but I know on other campuses the housing is contracted out. So that's a really good point. So listen, we're up at the hour. I wanted to time check if there's anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to bring up. I definitely wanted you to raise it. If there's anybody with any questions we didn't get to, please bring it up. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Let me just mention one thing.
Yeah,
I
go
don't
ahead.
know
Yeah.
if you mentioned, which is earlier I saw in the chat a couple folks talking about getting this book. It is available free, open access. So you can pick up a physical copy, but it's also open access. It's important for us that we did that. So if you just go to, you can find it anywhere, but if you go to University of Georgia Press website, they'll have a link to the digital version of it, and you can read it for free. So,
oh, right on. I didn't know that. I will find the link and put it in the show description, and give people a chance to dig in, and then we'll have another excuse to have you come back. But listen, again, thank you and Jared for this work. It was great meeting you sort of on the battlefields of the AAUP. And I look forward to building again. And at some point, I do want to have another discussion with you about this book you recommended in particular. Maybe we can reach out, have the author, and we can have a round table. I don't know, but and then let me also. Well, by the way, let me also ask you what I asked Jared. Is there anything you're working on that we should also be looking out for, or?
Well, in a way, I think it's directly connected. I've got a piece I'm trying to publish now, kind of looking at how we finance. I'm working on a book that deals with questions of finance and philosophy of money. It's a question of how we structure our financial apparatus to mobilize resources in ways that are more democratically accountable, right? And thinking about this both at kind of a macro level in terms of how governments can facilitate public finance, but also at a kind of more local communal level, like what can communities without direct access to government backing and sort of licensed banks and all this, how can they kind of create currencies in their communities as a means of mobilizing their labor and resources and provisioning themselves in ways that are more democratically accountable? So it's really a book about kind of heterodox ideas about philosophy of money, but thinking about what that looks like in the Black radical tradition. Some of this stuff about the Black University and questions about how we fund and finance sort of radical institutions in ways that don't simply depend upon sort of redistribution of white, philanthropic, revenue streams, or doesn't necessarily depend on the U.S. federal government and its kind of imperial apparatus. I'm trying to explore some of that. So I've got a piece that looks very specifically that hopefully will be published soon on sort of the history of thinking about financing the Black University in the 60s, and what it might look like to kind of revive some of those ideas for the sake of Black radical institution building in the present.
Yeah, that sounds dope. Okay. So I got to get the link to the article that you're going to have. You said it's likely to go up on AAUP's website about Morehouse and
I think so. Yeah,
the labor struggle.
Yeah, so they're going to.
And then
it's on the Morehouse website, but
Morehouse
it's a short little thing. It's going to go up on AAUP's blog today as well.
And then the open access link to Prophet of Discontent, and then we're going to keep an eye out for this forthcoming work on the philosophy of money, and then I will have that be the basis of our next invitation probably, and then I'll be looking out for Jared as well. So that's okay. Very good. And if anything else comes up in between, definitely reach out, send links, let me know. And
perfect. Thanks again for taking this book seriously and reading it so closely. And it's really gratifying to hear someone take your ideas seriously and really generously capture the spirit of what we're trying to convey. And so I really appreciate it.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.